Okay, so here's an application of what we've learned. And again, I'm going to go through examples, and we're going to make sure that you do understand this. I mean, last resort, you can use a formula to figure these out. X minus X bar divided by S. You can always do that. But my hope is that you'll have a deeper level of understanding, and you'll understand at a level where the formula really is not necessary, unless I were to give you some really obscure numbers, which I would never do. Remember, the rule is I never give you a calculation to do in your head unless I can do it in my head, and I can't do a lot in my head, which means you're safe. Okay, so let's say you're taking 3 classes, and this is the example that's in the book, but I'll go over it here because some people have trouble when they're just looking at it for the first time in the book. So let's say you're taking health psychology, everybody's favorite, organic chemistry, and creative writing. These are your 3 classes. Here's your average in the class. So you got 85%, that's your average in health. OChem, you got 79, and creative writing, a whopping 90%. So these are your final grades in each class. Now, before this chapter, you might have just looked to see, well, where did I do better? Where was I doing the best? And you might conclude, oh, I did the best in creative writing. Well, if the question is, which class did you get the higher score, 90 is the higher score. But if you're asking, in which class did I shine the brightest, all right, did I do the best relative to everybody else, then you have to consider that you're trying to compare apples to oranges. Health Psych has its distribution, these particular properties, a mean of 80 and a standard deviation of 4. Organic chemistry is its own distribution, right? It has a different mean and a different standard deviation, and the same thing with creative writing. It's got its mean and its own standard deviation. So it's like you're comparing apples to oranges to grapefruit, all right? You can't compare them directly. If the question is, in which case did I do the best, that's a relative performance question. You have to answer that by looking at, well, how well did you do compared to others in the class? It's all relative. All right. So what we're going to need to do in order to compare how you did in each class, to compare apples, oranges, and grapefruit, is we need to take each of these raw scores and convert them to Z. So if you need to, you can use the formula. So you would take your raw score minus the mean divided by S, right? And if if you're good at numbers in your head, these are doable. We'll use the formula, okay, just to, simplify it a little bit. Okay, so for health psychology, you've got to take your raw score. So at 85, that's your score here. 85 minus the mean, so minus the mean, and then divide by standard deviation, which means you're dividing by 4. And if you do that, it comes out to 1.25. Okay? Now we're going to do the same thing for organic chemistry. So you take your score, which is 79, minus the mean of the class, which is 74, divided by standard deviation, which is 5. And again, I'm just using these numbers. And that gives you a Z score of 1. Finally, in creative writing, the same thing. Your raw score minus the mean divided by standard deviation, and this gives you the Z score negative 0.5. All right. So now these are all Z scores, which means they all fall on the same Z score distribution. That Z score distribution will have a mean of 0, a standard deviation equal to 1, and a variance equal to 1. So with that, we're able to look at these numbers and say, well, in which class did you actually shine the brightest? It's the one where you were furthest above average, right? Well, where are you furthest above average? Here you're below average. Remember, negative means below average? So here you're below average. Here you're above average by 1. Here you're above average by 1.25. So you actually shone the brightest. You outperformed in health psychology. So I have another way of visualizing this. And what we're going to do is we're going to compare the raw and Z-score distributions just to see what they look like. You know, put one up against the other so you can understand the relationships between these Z-scores and their raw score distributions. Okay, so here's the normal distribution up here. Okay, now let's look at, sorry, I should just point out, so these numbers here along the x-axis, okay, not these colored numbers, but these numbers here, these are Z-scores. The colored numbers represent raw scores, okay? So just make sure you understand that, okay? So these are Zs, these are raw scores. Okay, let's take health psychology first. All right, so here are scores in the health psychology class. Now, from the previous page or slide, we know that 80 was the average in health psychology. What does 80 convert to on Z? Remember, whatever your average is, whatever the mean is here, it converts to 0. So this 80 becomes 0 on Z. Now, if we asked, well, what would 1 equal? 1 standard deviation unit on Z, if this is 80, what would be the raw score here when Z equals 1? Well, you have to ask, how far have we jumped in raw scores? We know that when you go from 0 to 1 Z-scores, you've jumped 1 standard deviation unit, right? But what is that in raw scores? So in health psychology, the standard deviation was 4, right? Standard deviation was 4. So that means if you go from 0 to 1, okay, now we have to just don't focus on the green or the red here, okay? Just look at the black. If you go from 0 to 1, 1 standard deviation unit here is the equivalent of 4 on the health psychology distribution. So if we start at 80 and jump 1 unit, we're now at 84. If we jump another unit, okay, to 2, that's another 4 units, so 84 now becomes 88. And when we jump from 2 to 3, we go from 88 plus 4 to 92. Now, what was your raw score in health psychology? Well, if it was 84, we could say, hey, we have a Z-score of 1, right? But it wasn't 84. It was 85. So 85, okay, up here, 85, you see how it's going to be a little bit bigger than 1? Because we've just established that if you were 1 unit above Z, that would be plus 4, right? Plus 4 from 80. That would be 84. You're actually 85. That means your Z-score is going to be a little bit bigger than 1. And it turned out to be 1.25, right, when we did the math. Now let's look at organic chemistry. So these are all the scores, well, not all the scores, but these are scores in OChem, right? Now, from the previous slide, we learned that the mean in organic chemistry was 74. So what does 74 become in the Z-score distribution? Remember the rule. The mean of any raw score distribution always becomes 0 on Z. It recalibrates. So 74 becomes 0. Okay? Now, if we jump 1 unit here, okay, jump 1 unit on Z, what is the equivalent in raw scores? So to answer that question, you have to go down to organic chemistry and then say, okay, well, 1 standard deviation unit is the equivalent of 5 raw scores. Why? Because the standard deviation in OChem was 5. All right, so if the standard deviation in organic chemistry is 5, that means 1 standard deviation unit is 5 raw scores. So if we start back here, we said the mean 74 becomes 0. If we jump 1, how far have we jumped in raw scores? Plus 5, right? We've jumped 5 raw scores. So 74 is represented by 0. If you jump 5 raw scores, what are you at now? 79. And as it turns out, that was your particular score. Remember, you got 79 in organic chemistry? So you are exactly 1 unit above the mean. All right? So again, 74 becomes 0. If you jump 1 unit, you've jumped 5 raw scores because that's the standard deviation for organic chemistry. So if you jump 5 raw scores, if you start at 74, you're now at 79. And again, 79 was your score, so that means your score is 1 on Z. And then the last one, creative writing. Here are all the scores in creative writing, the green. All right. The mean of the class was 91. By now, you should be able to tell me, what does 91 become on Z? It converts to 0, recalibrates, right? Becomes 0. All right. Now, if we're looking at creative writing, when we go 1 unit, here we're going to go below. If we go 1 unit on Z, how many raw scores is that? Going from 0 to -1. Well, you have to look over here and say, what was the standard deviation for this class? It was 2. So that means every time you move 1 unit on Z, you're actually moving 2 raw scores. So if we start at 91, which is 0, right? 0 equals 91, right? 91 recalibrates. If we go behind the mean, below the mean by 1 unit, we've moved the equivalent of 2 raw scores. So 91, you move 1 unit, that means -2, that drops you down to 89. What was your score? Well, wasn't it 90, right, in creative writing? So 90 puts you right smack between a 91 and an 89. That means it's going to put you right smack between a -1 and a 0. So your raw score of 90, what's halfway between 0 and -1? -0.5, right? See how your raw score is the equivalent of -0.5? If you had gotten 89 in the class, then that would have given you a -1. But you got a little bit better, so you're below average, not horribly, but a little bit below average. And your Z score is precisely between 0 and -1. It's -0.5. So now we can see the relative placement of all your scores. Here's your organic chemistry. All right, 90 sounds great until you realize you're below average. Here, 79, that doesn't sound like a very high average, right? You wouldn't want to go home and tell your parents, hey, I averaged 79. Well, I mean, 79 for some people is really, really high, perhaps, and that's great. And other people, well, that's not, anything to brag about. But at least you were above average. But 85, that's where you actually did the best. Health psychology. You are furthest above average in your health psychology class. All right? So this, this diagram here was just to help you see how scores line up. So here we have 3 different distributions. Even though they are 3 very different distributions, each of their sample means becomes 0 on Z. And what is 1 standard deviation unit jump? What does it equal in raw scores? Well, it depends. Because here, for health psychology, 1 unit equaled 4 raw scores. That's what your standard deviation was, remember? So 1 unit equaled 4. But when we were looking at OChem, 1 unit on Z is actually 5 raw scores. And then for creative writing, 1 unit on Z is actually only 2 raw scores. All right, so I wanted you to see how these distributions line up and how they compare. So hopefully that helps you a little bit. All right, so just to summarize, 85 in health psych is 5 raw scores above its mean. That places it at 1.25 standard deviation units above 0 on Z. 79 for chemistry, OChem, is 5 raw scores above its mean, but it's only 1 unit above, right? And it's because the standard deviation is different for those two distributions. Here the standard deviation is 4 and here it's 5. Okay, so that's why you get different answers here. And then finally, 90 for creative writing is 1 raw score, half a unit below its mean. All right, and again, once all the scores are on the Z-score distribution, you can compare them and see, how you did with each and where you shone the brightest.